Since Donald Trump came back into office for his second term, the world's been buzzing, and not always in a good way. In just a few days, he's flipped the script on a bunch of policies people thought were set in stone. He pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement and hit pause on foreign aid programs, sending shockwaves around the globe. But the latest move that's really making headlines? Trump's executive order to cut off funding for US foreign aid. While nearly everyone's criticizing this decision, there's one African leader who actually supports it, and maybe even cheers it on. That's President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, right in the heart of the Sahel region. Traoré sees this as a wake-up call, a chance for African nations to break free from dependence and stand on their own 2 feet. That's why he's been pushing hard to ramp up rice production in Burkina Faso, aiming for real self-reliance. In this video, we're diving into Burkina Faso's impressive strides in rice farming, breaking down what US foreign aid really means, and sharing why Traoré thinks Trump's decision might just be a blessing in disguise. So, let's dive in. On January 31, 2025, under President Traoré's orders, Madame Mariana Konate, governor of the Haut-Bassins region, visited a wheat field in Bazan, a developed plain where crops are thriving. What she saw backed up everything Traoré has been saying about African independence. Burkina Faso and many other African countries don't actually need financial handouts from the US or anyone else. Right now, Burkina Faso is on the brink of a major milestone. Thanks to this booming wheat and rice project, the country could soon produce enough rice to feed itself without relying on imports. These fields aren't just growing, they're thriving. And that success is thanks to Traoré's serious investment in agriculture. When Traoré first took office, he made one thing clear: security and self-sufficiency were top priorities. See, Burkina Faso has some of the richest land for rice farming in Africa. Yet despite this, the country has long been one of the biggest rice importers on the continent. That's because rice is a staple food here and demand is sky high. But Traoré sees importing rice, when you've got the land and potential to grow it yourself, as a major missed opportunity. So he rolled up his sleeves and decided to change the game. Back in 2024, President Traoré made a powerful move to boost rice production across Burkina Faso. He personally handed over 20 state-of-the-art optical sorters to rice mills at the Regional Directorate of Agriculture in Haut-Bassin. These machines, worth 180 million CFA before taxes, were bought by the National Office of Major Projects, and their mission was clear: upgrade the quality and competitiveness of locally grown rice. At the handover, President Traoré made his message loud and clear. We're giving these sorters to the hard-working cooperatives and rice producers so that from now on, the rice we eat is pure and free from impurities, he said. Quick reminder before we move on, if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button, drop a comment and subscribe so you don't miss any updates. Dr. Abdurrahman Konaid, Special Advisor to the President on Agricultural Issues, explained why this equipment is a game changer. Our national rice hasn't been competitive, partly because we haven't had enough sorting capacity to clean and polish the rice properly, he said. These sorters aren't your average machines. They're the latest generation optical sorters, packing a mind-blowing 64 million megapixels to spot impurities and perfectly size the rice grains. The 20 machines come with different processing powers. Some handle 1.6 tons per hour, others can manage between 4 to 6 tons. And it's not just about handing over the tech. Training programs are planned to make sure operators know exactly how to get the best out of these machines. Representing rice processors, Seydou Konaid, president of the Haut-Bassin Rice Innovation Platform, spoke about what this meant for them. This is a huge relief, he said. Our rice will finally stand toe-to-toe with imported rice in quality. This equipment will boost both the quality and competitiveness of national rice, making rice from Burkina Faso something truly valuable. Fast forward almost a year, and Traoré's vision is already paying off. On a recent visit to a sprawling farm, about 450 hectares, with 100 devoted to wheat, the president of the Cooperative Society of Wheat and Rice Production shared his optimism. "We're fully committed and ready to do even better," he said. He praised the government's support and said this first phase is a crucial learning experience that will help improve wheat and rice production for years to come. The governor was clearly pleased with how the crops were doing. "I saw wheat plants looking really healthy, especially at the spiling stage," she said. "That shows our farmers are following the expert advice and guidance from agricultural technicians." She encouraged farmers to keep pushing hard to help the country reach food self-sufficiency. Now here's the exciting part. Le Moulin du Sahel, a local wheat flour production company, assured the governor they're ready to buy every bit of wheat produced this season. That's huge news. Not only is the region growing its own wheat, but local factories are prepared to use that wheat instead of relying on imports. There's still work to be done, but it's clear Burkina Faso is on a strong path toward feeding itself. And get this, between 2022, when President Traoré took office, and 2024, rice production jumped from 280,000 metric tons to 326,000 metric tons. That's impressive, but it's not just rice and wheat that are booming. In 2023, agriculture made up 16.33% of Burkina Faso's GDP, which grew from $18.8 billion to $22.1 billion. Tomato production climbed from 315,000 metric tons in 2022 to 360,000 in 2024. Millet went from 907 to a whopping 1.1 million metric tons over the same period. All of this growth ties back to Traoré's bold investment in agriculture. But more than money, it's his mindset that's driving the change. Traoré firmly believes African nations should stand on their own 2 feet. He took a hard look at the natural resources Burkina Faso has been blessed with and decided to focus on adding value to those instead of constantly turning to so-called advanced economies for help. That's why he actually supports President Trump's controversial decision to cut off USAID funding. But what exactly is USAID, and why has Trump's move sparked so much backlash? Let's dive in. Right from the jump of his presidential campaign, Trump made one thing crystal clear. When it comes to spending overseas, everything has to fit his America First agenda. That's why just last week, he fired off a post on his Truth Social page, declaring that US foreign aid spending is totally unexplainable, and demanded it be shut down. Now, a little background. The United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, was created back in the early 1960s to handle humanitarian aid on behalf of the US government. It's a big operation, with about 10,000 employees worldwide, 2/3 of whom actually work overseas, according to the Congressional Research Service. USAID has a presence in over 60 countries and works in many more. But here's the thing. Most of the boots-on-the-ground work is actually done by other organizations that USAID funds and contracts. Their mission is wide-ranging. For instance, USAID doesn't just hand out food in famine-stricken areas. It runs the world's top famine detection system, using advanced data analysis to spot food shortages before they get worse. A huge chunk of their budget goes to health programs too, like polio vaccinations in countries where the disease still lingers, and efforts to stop the spread of viruses that could trigger a pandemic. According to government data, the US pumped $68 billion into international aid in 2023. That money is spread out among various departments and agencies. but USAID alone commands more than half of it, around $40 billion. Most of that cash flows into Asia, Africa, and Europe, with a big slice going to humanitarian relief in Ukraine. So, naturally, analysts warn that suspending this aid could hit African countries hard, and they're worried about what that means for the people depending on this support.
President Trump hasn't minced words.
He says USAID funding is a total waste of taxpayer money. His administration even released a list of USAID projects they say prove the agency's out of control. They pointed to a $1.5 million grant to an LGBTQ group in Serbia, $2.5 million spent on electric vehicles in Vietnam, and $6 million poured into tourism in Egypt. But Trump isn't the only one taking shots at USAID. Elon Musk, the world's richest guy and a big Trump supporter, called the agency a criminal organization and backed Trump's move to shut it down. Since Trump's executive order froze funding, chaos has erupted worldwide. Humanitarian aid efforts have been thrown into disarray, with staff laid off and the future of many programs hanging by a thread. So what's the fallout in Africa? That's where USAID money has been a lifeline for health programs, especially in places like South Africa, where it's helped fight HIV/AIDS. Just days after Trump's order, clinics treating HIV patients started shutting down, training sessions got cancelled, and centers supporting trans health were forced to close their doors. For example, the WITS Reproductive Health and HIV Institute's Trans Health program had to suspend services after the funding stopped. At the same time, South Africa's Medical Research Council cancelled a grant-writing workshop funded by the US National Institutes of Health following the freeze. Then there's PEPFAR, the US President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, which provides life-saving HIV treatment across Botswana, Mozambique, Namibia, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and beyond. They were told to halt all activities, including handing out antiretroviral meds. Experts warn this freeze could also cripple emergency responses to other outbreaks like Mpox and the deadly Marburg virus. But some African experts see Trump's move as a wake-up call. Angela Apogee, an assistant professor at the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, says it's high time African countries rely less on outside donors and focus on funding their own health sectors with smarter financial management. And guess what? That's exactly the message Burkina Faso's President Traoré has been pushing all along.
You know, it's wild how many African countries rely so heavily on the West for just about everything. It's almost unbelievable, especially when you consider that Africa is packed with both the people and resources to stand on its own 2 feet. But here's the kicker. Recent moves by Trump really shine a spotlight on just how risky this dependency is. Imagine if Africa wasn't so reliant on Western aid. Those decisions wouldn't shake the continent like they do now. Right now, African nations are left picking up the pieces, scrambling to cope with the ripple effects of those policies. But here's a twist that might surprise you. Most folks assume Africa's economy and progress comes straight from Western aid. That's not quite the reality. Sure, some have benefited from Western funding, no doubt. But the truth? For the vast majority of Africans, that aid doesn't really touch their lives. It's why, aside from the health sector, stopping US aid won't cause the massive disruptions people expect. Why? Because a huge chunk of that money meant for development and fighting poverty gets swallowed up by corrupt leaders and their inner circles. This cycle of theft is so entrenched, it's basically become an institution, keeping millions of people from actually seeing the help they're supposed to get. So if US aid is just fueling corruption, shouldn't we question whether it makes sense to keep sending billions under these conditions?
Instead of helping the people who truly need it, officials, bureaucrats, and wealthy elites are lining their pockets, while the rest of the population struggles in poverty. Groups like Transparency International have exposed shocking scams, showing how some leaders stash stolen cash offshore or blow it on luxury properties abroad. Take disease-fighting aid, for example. Many African countries get millions from the US to combat malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. But reports reveal a harsh truth. Funds intended for buying medical supplies often vanish or get mismanaged, leaving hospitals without essential medicines. So here's the big question. How can Africa break free from this cycle? How can the continent harness its own strengths, cut out corruption, and build a future that's truly independent? That's the conversation we need to have, because Africa has everything it needs to thrive. It just needs to take control.
Let's rewind a bit
And talk about Ethiopia under Mengistu Haile Mariam's Marxist dictatorship. This regime was a major recipient of foreign aid, money that was supposed to help with famine relief. But here's the harsh reality. Instead of feeding starving people, a chunk of that aid was diverted to fund a forced resettlement program. Trucks meant to deliver food were actually bought to move people around by force. And it gets worse. Some of the worst-hit areas were deliberately left without relief because it suited Mengistu's regime to let their political opponents starve. But Ethiopia's story isn't unique. Take the Congo, for example. They took donated food supplies and sold them off, using the cash to buy an arms factory from Italy. Then there's Mauritius, a much more peaceful place, but they also diverted aid rice, insisting it be top quality only to funnel it into tourist hotels instead of the people who needed it. Fast forward to more recent times, and Nigeria's experience during the COVID-19 pandemic tells a familiar story. Palliative aid, meant for everyday citizens, ended up hoarded by politicians, doled out only to those who'd vote for them. The World Bank, the European Union, Western governments, they all know that a big slice of this aid gets funneled into the pockets of corrupt leaders and NGOs. Yet they keep sending the money, still calling these governments partners in development. If they really wanted Africa to rise, wouldn't they have found a better way by now? Why keep pouring billions into aid that's clearly going nowhere? It's pretty obvious they're getting something out of it. This brings us to a bigger, more uncomfortable truth. Aid to Africa isn't just charity. It's a tool for Western exploitation. Remember that eye-opening 2014 report? It showed Africa receives about $133.7 billion a year in aid. A huge number, right? But here's the twist. That same year, $191.9 billion was taken out of Africa through debt repayments, profits made by multinational companies, and illicit financial flows. And that's just 2014. The number is even higher now. What does that mean? Africa is actually losing over $85 billion every year. In other words, Africa isn't being helped by the West, it's the other way around. Africa is helping build up the West's wealth, while Western aid keeps holding Africa down. It's a system that's been rigged for too long, and it's time we start calling it out for what it really is.
Most of the aid Africa gets from Western countries
doesn't come without strings attached. Here's the catch. One big condition is that foreign multinational companies get free rein to set up shop in Africa, giving them the green light to tap into the continent's resources. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real problem? Aid has created a dangerous dependency, and honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons Africa needs to stop relying on foreign aid. Since aid started pouring in, it's become a major chunk of government budgets across the continent. Back in 2009, in countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, Rwanda, Gambia, and Burundi, foreign aid made up anywhere from 50% to a staggering 92% of government spending. Think about that for a second. Every year, African countries draft their budgets expecting aid money as part of their income. No wonder it's so easy for Western powers to call the shots. If a country refuses to play along, the West can simply pull the plug on aid and say, "No money unless you do what we want." We saw this play out with Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali after their coups. Aid was cut off, sending a clear message. Aid has become a weapon, just like sanctions, used to control African nations. And beyond politics, this dependency is killing local innovation and businesses. Take the corn shipped by the UN to Kenya as an example. A portion of that corn ends up dumped on the black market at rock-bottom prices. What do you think happens to local corn farmers? They're basically forced out of business because no one can compete with free or near-free corn, flooding the market. The result: when a real famine hits, Kenya won't have enough local reserves to lean on because their own farmers couldn't survive the pressure. It's a brutal cycle, and it's not just about food. Look at the textile industry. In 1997, Nigeria's textile sector employed about 137,000 workers. By 2003, that number plummeted to just 57,000. Why? Because Europeans shipped their old clothes to Africa, selling them dirt cheap. Naturally, people buy the cheaper clothes instead of the ones made locally. It's tough to blame them when the price difference is so huge, but the impact on local businesses and jobs is devastating. This cycle of dependency and exploitation is choking Africa's potential. It's time to rethink how aid works, or better yet, stop the aid that's doing more harm than good.
Here's the hard truth nobody likes to admit.
Foreign aid has done more damage than good for Africa. For decades, it's painted the continent as helpless, like Africa can't solve its own problems or build its own future without handouts from the West. But guess what? It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it's time to flip the script completely. Imagine a world where Africa doesn't rely on foreign aid. Sounds scary at first, right? But without aid coming in, African countries would be forced to get creative. They'd have no choice but to find ways to generate their own income, building local industries, boosting agriculture, and trading more with neighboring countries. Instead of leaning on outside help, Africa would have to rely on itself. And that, my friend, could be the game changer. When aid dries up, it forces a focus on infrastructure: roads, railways, electricity, and internet, because that's what's needed to power real growth. Without the crutch of free or cheap imports flooding the markets, farmers and local producers would have every reason to roll up their sleeves and get to work. Think about it. If farmers can't just depend on imported food that's dumped at rock-bottom prices, they'll have to grow more, work harder, and innovate to survive. This isn't the end of Africa. It's the beginning of a new chapter. And here's the real kicker. Africa wouldn't just survive without aid. It would thrive. It would become more resilient, more independent, and more confident in its own abilities. The continent is bursting with potential: people, resources, creativity. And without foreign aid holding it back, that potential could finally be unleashed. So, what do you think? Is it time for Africa to break free from this cycle of dependency and build its future on its own terms? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, hit that like button if you agree, and don't forget to share this video with your friends so we can keep this conversation going. Because the truth is, Africa's story is still being written, and it's got the power to be one of the greatest comebacks in history.